Good afternoon. Thanks again to the previous speakers and for the invitation to be here today. I'd like to take a second and give you a little bit more political background. As you all undoubtedly know, there has been an explosion in sequence data over the past decade. But what's important to remember is to overlay the political decisions or the policy decisions that have been made around those same times. So here, for example, I have put a blue arrow here to remind you that in 2010, the Nagoya Protocol was negotiated. And since then, there has been a huge explosion in sequence data. So in the 10 years prior to the Nagoya Protocol being negotiated, policymakers did not really have it on their radar how much the life sciences would change after that agreement went into force. The other things, of course, that have been happening in parallel are the biotechnological tools that have changed since then. Synthetic biology has grown incredibly, and of course, last year's Nobel Prize in Medicine has created incredible precision and efficiency with which the genome can be edited. So all of these tools taken together make the argument to policymakers that our requirement to go back to the physical genetic resource is not as great as it once was, which means the validity of the political agreement that was reached in signing the CBD and the Nagoya Protocol, that a researcher would have to go back to a country to access their biological resources, which would incentivize sustainable use and benefit sharing, is no longer the same relationship that it once had. Now, that's not to say that we don't still need to access physical genetic resources. I work at a collection. We do, we will, but yet fundamentally, the scene has changed since these agreements were agreed to. However, the DSI data ecosystem, as my previous colleagues have mentioned, is not at all like the Nagoya Protocol. So here's some highline statistics that help to give a sense of that. The current size of the INSDC, so of GenBank or ENA or DDBJ, is about 212 billion sequences. They come from every country in the world. The entire DSI data set is downloaded in its entirety about 34 million times a year. There are about 10 to 15 million users, again, in every country in the world. And these data are then promulgated through 2,000 downstream databases, ultimately landing being reused and cited in about 500,000 publications and patent applications. So it's a really, really big system, and not a system that is at all appropriate for the sort of rubber stamp system of the Nagoya Protocol, or even for the SMTA within the international treaty. The other important lessons to know about the DSI ecosystem is that most DSI does not come from low and middle income countries. So as you can see here, about 52% come from China, the United States, Canada, and Japan. There are 10 to 15 million users of the core DSI databases, and they live in every country in the world. And importantly, the infrastructure costs are about $50 million per year to maintain this core data infrastructure. And about half of the users, so about $25 million, is spent on the users whose governments do not pay for access to this infrastructure. So if we want to look a little bit further downstream, after the DSI land in the databases, we can start to understand what the reuse or the application of DSI is within the scientific community. And so what we did here was to take about 8 million sequences and about 115,000 open access scientific publications, and we mined them to try to look for these patterns. So here's an example of one publication that's in this data set, a virus found in Bolivia, published by Peruvian authors, an author that was located in Peru at the time of publication, that in the manuscript cited a unique identifier, an accession number for sequences. These sequences numbers, the identifiers, can be mined using text mining and then looked up in the database and associated with a country of origin. So in this case, the country is Brazil. That's the country of origin where the material came from, and the authors in this case would be the using country, which would be Peru. So using this kind of a setup, you can now say, okay, who are the providers and who are the users of DSI? And once we do that, we can go through and ask for all the countries in the world, what are the providers and the users of DSI? And an amazing trend kind of comes up here. So we see along the x-axis, the amount of DSI that is being used by scientists. And on the y-axis, the amount of DSI that's being provided to different countries. And so you can see here a mid-sized country like Brazil actually is using more than they are providing. So they're providing data to 111 countries, and they're using data from 153 countries. Here's Germany up here, a similar trend. But perhaps what's most interesting is that the relationship between providing DSI and using DSI is actually roughly equal. You see a pretty nice linear trend there. And this tells us actually that the system is not a one-way street. The DSI use and reuse is not from the provider, from the global south, from low and middle income countries, heading up towards the global north to be used by high income country scientists. In fact, provisioning and using tend to happen at relatively similar ratios. And if you take this data set that I just described, and you look at it according to more economic blocks, so here we have on the x-axis, the OECD, which is high income countries, G77, which are the developing world, low income countries, and then the sort of middle income countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And if you take the data and group it into these three blocks, which makes it easier to look for overall trends, you see something very interesting. DSI is in fact used more by locals than by foreigners. So here at the bottom, in every bar, where the country of origin is from one of these economic blocks, you see that the biggest chunk of that bar graph is from that region. So OECD is biggest, OECD users use OECD data the most, DSI the most. G77 users use G77 data the most. And BRICS countries use BRICS data the most. Another important aspect is that OECD data is actually used 3 times more than BRICS or G77. So actually, what I think we want over time, our global goal should be to try to fill in this gap. If we're going to talk about DSI and we're going to talk about benefit sharing, we need to figure out how do we get more DSI from these countries into the databases so that it can be used, and that the broader concepts and the broader goals of the CBD for conservation of biological diversity, for sustainable use, and also for benefit sharing can be realized because the data is there. And finally, one last take-home message, and an important one for us, is that there are 40% fewer DSI-based publications from BRICS and G77 authors, from low and middle income authors, than there are from OECD. So if you sum up all of the number of publications going across, you see there are still significant inequalities in the world. Sorry, I kind of sneezed. And this is in fact a trend that we want to change over time. If you'd like to talk more about policy options, about what this data means and what kinds of options would be available, excuse me, to maintain open access to DSI, and what are some multilateral and even possibly bilateral solutions to this problem, we released a white paper in October of 2020 that laid out a variety of options that could be considered by policymakers. We are talking a lot in recent months about a decoupled multilateral framework for benefit sharing and for DSI. And here, if you look at this graph, the big picture idea is that we believe there are a number of different ways that you could decouple benefit sharing up here at the top from the use of open data and open databases. Create a multilateral fund that will be distributed back towards capacity building, towards research, towards infrastructure for DSI, and also towards the purposes of biodiversity, for conservation and sustainable use, as I mentioned, and that you would still be able to use country data, such as I just showed you in the earlier data set, to be able to offer, for example, bonus payments for the distribution of the multilateral fund back to countries to recognize their unique contribution to the DSI system. So this is still a very novel idea that we're exploring in more depth in a publication, but which I hope can stimulate some of the conversations around possible benefit sharing mechanisms in the future. And with that, I'd like to wrap up and offer A little plug for some events that are going on next week on July 5th and 6th, organized by the DSI Scientific Network and a multilateral solution idea. Please go ahead and Google this and come and visit us if this topic interests you. Get involved. And with that, I'd like to thank all of the really important collaborators, and in particular Jens Freitag from the IPK and Gottesleben, who would have been giving this talk today if he would have been able to. So thanks, Jens, for including me here today.